Piers Morgan. Total cock. Sorry, no, I meant interesting character, for the sake of balance. You'd be forgiven for feeling conflicted in regards to this man, given that he's an obnoxious reactionary media mouthpiece turned accountability hero, after he seemed to be one of the only journalists in the country capable of holding this ridiculously appalling Conservative government to the fire over their atrocious handling of the pandemic. Needless to say, Piers has swung from multiple sides over his career, but there is one thing about him that has never shifted. He's a notoriously bad debater.
1 in 6 schools is having to crowdfund from parents for basic equipment before we get to relatively low priority issues.
What's going on, guys? Given the relative success of my previous political video concerning Black Lives Matter, which seriously generated 10, 20, sometimes even 50 times my usual views, I thought it was about time I did another. Little Christmas treat, why not? Now, as I mentioned before, there are many things wrong with the world right now, and I've been truly racking my brains about what I could hone in on and talk about, and then it hit me. It's obviously not a one-solution-fits-all deal, but it's as near as you could bloody well get to it, and that, of course, is discourse. Honestly, the state of political discourse these days is utterly dreadful, and it's all founded in the current state of political debate and the ethos surrounding it. Televised public debates, in theory, should have skyrocketed voter turnout, as one can't deny that they offer a certain widespread compatibility with the general public that research and manifesto analysis sadly lack. Because, seriously, who has the time for that? They've got the potential to be one of the most politically transparent discourse devices known to man, yet voter turnout steadily declined ever since the first ever televised debate between JFK and Richard Nixon. Political disillusionment has, on the whole, been rising, and it's probably got something to do with the fact that these debates end up being about as convoluted as the plot of Predestination, which you should watch, seriously, it's a great film, go watch it. No, this is not a paid promotion. So why is it that they seem to cloud more than they clear? There are a few reasons, but the biggest one is this. Look into scholarly resources on debating, and you'll notice a few things about truth, process, integrity, but then you'll find the clincher, the footnote that resonates throughout society. The goal is to win. Win at all costs. Well, okay, it's not that bad, but it is ingrained in the way we all argue with each other, the need to be right, the belief that we hold the truth. It doesn't help that news outlets broadcasting political debate tend to ask who won, that debating competitions exist where there is a defined winner at the end, that during political campaigns the winner gets elected. It's my personal opinion, particularly in ethical and political spheres, that the goal of debate is not to have a winner, but rather that the truth be heard. And I'm not the only one who thinks this. When the goal is to win, the goal simultaneously becomes to not lose. And I don't know if you've seen football lately, but people do pretty shitty things to not lose when there's something on the line. Be it that precious 3 points, or, oh, I don't know, maybe a fucking presidential election? Which brings us to the topic of this video. Intellectual dishonesty. As much as recent events featuring a certain right-wing populist suggest, getting away with downright lying in serious public debate is hard. If it's not the moderators calling you out on it, which admittedly doesn't happen nearly as often as it should, it'll be genuine fact-checkers, comedians, and hell, anyone in the general public with half a brainstem seeing you as a Billy bullshitter, as my countrymen would say. So if you want to get away with clouding the truth to protect your ego, status, and agenda, you'll have to get creative. Intellectual dishonesty is this: utilising specific dodgy tactics to attempt to hide the flaws of your points, of your plans for a country, of your views in politics. Because, well, it doesn't take a genius to work out that if your side of the debate appears to be flawless, how the hell could you lose the debate? Now, there are a great many tactics you could pull from the Intellectual Dishonesty Handbook, of which I am not the definitive source. You'd be much better off looking through the works of Shane Snow or Ian Danskin of Innuendo Studios to discover all the tricks in the book, and hell, they'd probably be the first to tell you they aren't definitive either. Isn't academia wonderful? But of course, you clicked on my video, so I'll do my best to go through it all with you. How to recognise the main tactics, how to avoid falling for them, and how to avoid accidentally using them. Source list down there, by the way. And to do this, unfortunately, we have to bring back our friend Piers Morgan.
What have you got against plants? Plants are living things.
Across his career, Piers has earned his place alongside the gravediggers of discourse, next to Tucker Carlson, Ben Shapiro, Donald fucking Trump. You've probably seen a debate of his and felt that something wasn't quite right. Perhaps it's the way he inflammatorily shouts his points at the other side, or the way he tends to interrupt and talk over them, or go full ad hominem when his arguments don't quite sink in. And you'd be right to feel that way. You'll also probably not be surprised to find out this is just the tip of the world's snakiest iceberg too. Piers commands all the major talking points of intellectual dishonesty and has gotten pretty damn good at using them. He'll do things such as outright dodging or ignoring questions and counterpoints put to him, drawing false equivalencies and jumping to a stretched conclusion to besmirch someone's point, lying or deceiving by omission, and generally being a massive dickhead by interrupting, shouting, and throwing his toys out of the pram when confronted. Now, I would like to interrupt myself before I go any further down the Piers Morgan rabbit hole of dick fuckery. I firmly acknowledge and actually have even praised the fact that Piers has been a true warrior of journalism during this past year. Where almost every other major journalist or news anchor has failed, Piers has done a stunning job in exposing the government's deceitful and flawed handling of the... do you know what? I'm just going to say it. Coronavirus pandemic. It's not like this video is going to be monetized either way. Hashtag please subscribe. Genuinely, Piers has exposed them and held them to account over their pay rises, their policies concerning the NHS, PPE, you name it, Piers has been there. However, this doesn't excuse how much of a shitty debater he's been throughout his career, and hell, if you really wanted to, you could categorise his methods of holding the government to account as simply another branch of his intellectually dishonest bullshit tree. The only difference is that the modern Conservative Party have themselves sunk so far into the oily depths of the intellectual dishonesty swamp that it's kind of nice to see it happening back to them for once. So moving swiftly back, it is one of Piers' older debates that I've seen again recently that we'll be using as our case study. It showcases an effectively broad spectrum of intellectual dishonesty, and funnily enough, not just from Piers. See? They're everywhere! In fact, obeying Shane Snow's instruction of taking one's political hat off, basically everyone in this debate will showcase at least one instance of intellectual dishonesty. Yes, it happens on the left too. Can't say I'm not balanced now. The debate in question is of course the debate between himself and Member of Scottish Parliament Ross Greer about Greer's comments towards the legacy of Winston Churchill, claiming that he was a white supremacist and mass murderer. Before we get into it, I'll bring up a couple of contextual points about the debate that should spark a little thought. You'll notice that Piers, who naturally will be defending Churchill, has a couple of allies in this one, Susanna Reid and Bob Seeley. This puts Ross Greer at an automatic disadvantage, as not only does it create the impression that defending Churchill is much more important than criticising him, but it also means that Ross will be receiving 3 sets of critical comments he must address, giving him less opportunity to freely clarify his position. Also, evidence does exist that suggests Ross is correct in his labelling of Winston Churchill as a white supremacist and a mass murderer. Some sources are much more conclusive than others, but it is there. Churchill has gone on record to state that he believed the white race had won the social Darwinian hierarchy, paraphrased, sorry, and if you need me to explain why that comment is born of white supremacy, this video is clearly not for you. He has also shown contempt for Indian people in a variety of ways, not to mention his actions, or inaction, that can be argued to have contributed to the deaths of thousands of Indian people during the Second World War. I'd consider it callous to label him as merely a white supremacist and mass murderer, but to dismiss, deny, or downplay these 2 heinous character flaws would simply be a lie. There is also evidence to suggest other major points about his character. His charismatic leadership of the country was almost certainly pivotal in Britain's plight during the Second World War, and his decision-making, at least in military terms, was similarly strong and, as history would have it, successful. But this doesn't negate Ross's point. One final thing before the meat of the video begins, I'd encourage you all to go and watch it for yourselves, to be sure I'm not taking anything discussed out of context. Link will be in the description. Let's go.
With a number, I think 7 or 8, clapping emojis, applauding your own genius in describing Sir Winston in that manner.
And Piers, you're a sensitive soul. Yesterday you accused me of being a racist for pointing out that you look like honey-glazed gammon.
So the debate hasn't really started well here. These are minor nitpicks when it comes to intellectual dishonesty, but they're dishonest nonetheless. It's clear that Piers and Ross don't like each other and have had previous arguments that didn't end well, after Piers' genius comment and Ross's gammon comment. This sort of stuff fast-tracks the heatedness of the debate, which is obviously not ideal for rational discourse. I'd advise not going straight for the jugular with your ad hominem katana in the first 30 seconds.
To the greatest Britain of the last century for a reason, is that people believe that he almost single-handedly, through the power of his rhetoric in World War II, saved this country from the Nazis. Again, you laugh. That sneering little laugh.
That won the war. It was the soldiers, the sailors, and the airmen who won the war, and they voted him out when they came home.
Not a great start for Ross, eh? Again, this is quite minor, but his interrupting doesn't make him look good, and if he continues, it will devalue his points for the neutral. This type of dirty debating will inevitably raise tensions more, so if someone's continuously interrupting, for whatever reason, they're not aiding the discourse. All I'll further say on this matter is that both sides will end up doing this, so the credibility score of Ross and Piers will probably even out by the end, though I'd go as far as to say that, spoiler alert, Piers is hands down bottom of the credibility league table in this one.
There is a creeping attempt now to besmirch everything that Churchill stands for.
Here we come to the first major talking point of intellectual dishonesty. Logical fallacies. Generally speaking, a logical fallacy is when a debater appears to be making an obvious logical point, and yet, upon closer scrutiny, it ends up making no sense. There are many different types of logical fallacy an intellectually dishonest debater can make, of which there are too many to look at today. If you're interested in a comprehensive guide, the website yourlogicalfallacyis.com is pretty definitive. Piers here is employing the tactic referred to as a leap of logic. He's taking Ross's argument to a violent extreme by claiming that there's an emerging attempt to undermine everything Churchill stands for, which is... really, Piers? Everything? Are we to assume that views on race and the desire to kill completely define a man's political standing? Let's be clear here, Ross has merely called into question Churchill's comments and behaviour that fall under the category of white supremacy, and any actions he's taken that could brand him a mass murderer. Nothing more. Therefore, it is an entirely stretched leap of logic to suggest everything Churchill stood for is being attacked. It paints Ross as more of a reactionary to make him seem less credible, or at the very least attempts to garner sympathy from sceptical neutrals by claiming that it's not just Ross shining a negative light on Churchill, though Piers has zero evidence to support this leap. And these types of fallacies are difficult to spot if you're unaware of them, though you'll soon realise, once you've developed a sense for them, just how incredibly often they're used. There's almost an element of creative expression behind them. In this case, Piers is almost exaggerating for effect when he leaps to an extreme conclusion about Ross's comments to hammer home his point more. It can be easily interpreted as merely passionate fury towards what have so far been portrayed as heinous, cataclysmic accusations intent on tearing down a hero, except, as we've just discussed, these comments do no such thing and merely seek to bring up a discussion about a few facets of what was a pretty complex character. It's important in these situations to always listen and digest what both sides are saying, and nailing each premise and its implications down to a T. Doing this will also make it easier to avoid committing the same logical fallacies as Piers here, as it's hard to accidentally stretch logic when you comprehensively understand what it's attempting to achieve. Although, as it's going to become abundantly clear, Piers is trying to sell his points and not really attempting to debate Ross. Essentially, he's making this leap on purpose.
This just gets everybody's goat up.
Again, this wild leap and baseless assumption Piers is making is logically fallacious. Gets everybody's goat. Piers, mate, you've got to start backing these claims up. Just because someone you know also doesn't like Ross's comments doesn't mean the whole world shares your views. Falsely painting it as this is an attempt to belittle and undermine Ross's point, for if Ross is painted as allyless, it makes it a lot easier for viewers to believe he is simply a mad, isolated reactionary who must be wrong. This is obviously not true, and the attempt to deceive here is very intellectually dishonest.
I don't defend everything Churchill did or said, right? I think he's a complex, difficult character in many ways.
As any historical hero will be.
A couple of points about this clip. Firstly, Piers is massively downplaying the flaws of Churchill being discussed. I'll admit this isn't strictly speaking him being intellectually dishonest, as he could genuinely believe that white supremacist views and a penchant for violent resolution isn't that bad. This is purely a subjective point. Personally, I believe that these two features of Churchill's character should not be downplayed like this, and should in fact be taken seriously. The downplaying does achieve a similar outcome to a logical fallacy, however, as it further attempts to belittle Ross's position, and therefore could also be considered intellectually dishonest. And let's not beat about the bush, it probably was. Piers is later going to argue as if these flaws are a bad thing, so he's clearly not downplaying them by accident. The other point here is that Susanna Reid attempts another type of logical fallacy, the false equivalency. This tactic is used to, again, downplay a point, or sometimes upplay? Is that a word? It does this by comparing it to and drawing equivalence with something it has no business being compared to. Imagine if I compared the Labour Party to the Conservative... Right, start again. Imagine if I compared the 2019 Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn to the Conservative Party at the time, claiming that they were just as bad as each other because they're all politicians. I'm sure you've probably heard that one before, right? Whilst there are annoying things that all politicians do, to say they're as bad as each other is wildly inaccurate because of the vastly different policy platforms they operate from. Ergo, it's illogical to dismiss them all with the same hand. Susanna Reid here makes this kind of logical leap. By claiming all major historical figures have a dark side, she's essentially saying, oh, who hasn't done a bit of white supremacy / equally dangerous bout of bad shit? And to be fair, she's not far from the truth, as several historical figures did have a dark side. Albert Einstein was notorious for his adultery, Karl Marx spoke some anti-Semitic tropes, Stephen Gerrard punched a DJ. However, as you've probably realised, these are all very different levels of bad, and therefore shouldn't be compared with each other. Hence, Susanna Reid's equivalency that seeks to downplay Churchill's white supremacy is false. The simplest way to avoid doing this is to treat the case in an isolated sense, and only compare it with cases of a similar sense. Also, try not to downplay something like this. And lastly, another nitpick, Susanna's use of the word hero is kinda shifting the framing of the debate and creating an illusion of assumption that everyone believes Winston Churchill was inherently good. For the purposes of objectivity, she shouldn't really be doing that.
But the idea that you simply eliminate... We heard a rant there, which at no point offered any balance or any attempt to say anything positive at all about this man.
Just thought I'd showcase this clip as the seed of a massive logical fallacy carrot that will be growing later on.
If you want to portray somebody as a racist, in the sense that Ross does with his eloquent stupidity, it's very easy to do so.
So Bob Seeley also starts the debate poorly, with a lovely little ad hominem jab at Ross, which isn't great really since he's an elected MP. You'd expect him to have some intellectual honesty. Ugh, seriously, who am I kidding? He's camouflaged this little insult well in his miniature rant. In fact, you can see Ross acknowledging it with a little wry smile, indicating that it's getting to him one way or another, and this is precisely the point behind these jabs, to wind Ross up and either paint him as reactionary when he bites back, or guilty when he doesn't address it. Dirty debating at its finest. I told you, they're everywhere. It's also important to note the rewriting history comment, which is yet another leap of logic with a little hint of strawman argument inside. You see, no one is arguing to completely repaint Winston Churchill's position in the history books here, just that we should be honest about his flaws. This is what a strawman argument is. Misrepresenting your opponent's point and painting it as an alternate version so you can have the argument you want to have, because you think you'll have a better chance of winning. What's really happening though is you're merely creating the perfect losing opponent in your head and arguing with that instead, meaning that in this case, Piers, Susanna and Bob aren't actually addressing Ross's points. Why does this work if it's so paper thin? Well, because of just how often they falsely reframe the argument. You'd be forgiven for thinking that Ross is arguing from the position they've created, since this is the position they're addressing over and over again. But with the knowledge of a strawman argument in your mind, all you need to do when observing a debate is remember the position each side is arguing from, and then keep track of when the debaters attempt to alter the terms of their conflict.
But if you want to portray Churchill as a racist, my great-great-uncle and he, when they were Conservative MPs, they crossed the floor to the Liberals, in part because of their outrage at the treatment of Chinese indentured labour in South Africa.
Yet another logical fallacy. Seriously, how is Bob an elect... Oh, please don't answer that question. The point here is simple. Bob is arguing that, because Churchill and some other Conservative Party members crossed the floor about Chinese labour in South Africa, the racist tag isn't appropriate. Yet, there's more than one race, Bob. There are multiple races, and it is possible to be prejudiced against one, but not the other. This is the black friend argument, slightly reappropriated. This term was originally coined by the common logical fallacy, I can't be racist, I have a black friend, which obviously is flawed for a number of reasons, such as there are many circumstances where those two characteristics of you could coexist, and that, as I've just stated, you could be prejudiced towards other races or nationalities whilst having your black friend. Hell, your black friend could also be racist and agree with you. Remember this one, we're just about to revisit it.
You can say that Churchill was an old guard Conservative, and yet he supported the People's Budget in 1911. He campaigned for better treatment for coal miners, for shop workers, and he did many things which we will now regard as being central to the foundation of the welfare state.
Again, we see an adaptation of the black friend argument being deployed here. Just because you can demonstrate one deed to the contrary, this does not absolve you of or change the fact you could be the thing that you're being accused of. If the Conservative Party demonstrates some policies that seem quite liberal, it doesn't alter the fact that they are still conservative. Hell, look at the modern Conservative Party. They've kept the NHS around for years despite it being an incredibly socialist-driven institution. Guess they're liberal now, right? Wrong, because they've also gutted and or privatised many other public services in the meantime. The important thing to remember about the black friend argument is that if someone only provides one example of a contradicting action, they still, overall, have not been absolved of their perceived label. Having a black friend doesn't mean that you can use the N-word, in the same way that supporting the welfare state doesn't mean you can label your mostly right-wing party liberal.
Bengal famine, you say yourself. They had a choice between feeding Bengal and feeding the Balkans, and at the time, Churchill, one of his great attributes, he focused this nation.
This is perhaps one of the funniest parts of the debate. Bob gets halfway through a point, then stops himself. I wonder why you did that, Bob. Well, later on, Ross shows us why.
It wasn't to feed people in the Balkans. It was to stockpile food in the Balkans. There were not shortages.
There we go. It's because he realised it didn't help his cause. Sorry about that, just a bit of fun. Let's continue.
Then there are copies of letters he sends to the Prime Minister of Canada, to Australia, to Franklin D. Roosevelt and others, repeatedly over the next 2 years, in which he is beseeching them to help the people of Bengali. For you to categorise that as him being to blame for the deaths of 3 million people in Bengali, it's not just offensive, it is a downright lie.
So we're finally onto some actual debate here. Piers brings his source to the table, and unfortunately does so in a pretty dishonest manner. You see, what we're seeing here is yet another black friend argument. Just because Churchill sent this letter, he's not absolved of the racist tag that's been associated with him. I mean, this letter is the black friend right now, if you catch my drift. All in the name of painting Ross as a reactionary, but upon further scrutiny, it is backfiring.
No, Piers, you just don't understand history. That's the problem.
I'm reading history. I'm reading history from the cabinet papers, quoting his own words.
Yeah, both of them are not debating very well here. A moderator would have helped, but they should both know better, really.
So you mentioned who was then the Viceroy of India when Weevil was the Field Marshal in Winston Churchill's own war cabinet with Leo Amery, his Secretary of State for India. The two of them were sitting down planning how to get food to Bengal at the start of that famine. Churchill came in and stopped them, as is recorded in both of their diaries. In fact, Churchill spent so long stopping people from getting aid to Bengal. You mentioned Canada and Australia. Australian wheat ships were trying to dock in Calcutta, and Churchill refused.
You see, this is better. Ross is now presenting his sources and taking Piers' down nicely. Both sources are almost certainly correct, I won't deny, but Ross's point remains valid due to the fact that, as with the previous discussion, there exist many more sources that paint Churchill as a racist or white supremacist than the contrary, and just because one contrary source exists, it doesn't absolve the overall label being placed here. We're finally seeing what a debate should be, some clear premises, followed by some sources and conclusions. If only it stayed this way.
While 3 million Indians were starving to death, parents were killing their children rather than see them starve to death. It was after a year of that Churchill finally realised.
Piers full-on cuts Ross off here by interrupting. This is classic dirty debating and should be a red flag to anyone watching that Piers is not happy his source has been so fervently ripped to shreds. The interruption is an attempt to cauterise that wound.
I'm seriously concerned about the food situation in India. Last year, we had a grievous famine in Bengali, through which at least 700,000 people died. This year is a good crop of rice, but we're faced with an acute shortage of wheat, aggravated by unprecedented storms. He's begging Franklin D. Roosevelt for help, but actually Roosevelt was unable to give him because he was...
That's after he had destroyed 46,000 boats that could have got food around Bengal. He let that famine happen.
So let me explain to you.
After it happened for so long, after the photos reached the rest of the world and outraged the rest of the world, he then had to do something about it.
Do you know what Sir Winston Churchill was actually doing?
Yeah, they're both at it again. It's at this point that I'll mention, when both sides are doing this, you may want to consider who started it. It's a bit childish, I know, but I'm personally certain that Ross isn't a bad debater at heart. It's just that Piers has wound him up a lot here. character, which definitely was the intention.
What is funny about any of this? What is funny about your attempts to smear
Piers,
the reputation of a great leader like Winston Churchill?
This ad hominem interruption from Ross isn't cool, but this is a classic Piers Morgan move. He's going straight for the character and not the argument, implying almost that there's deep personal gain to be made from making this argument. This is, in essence, Piers throwing his toys out of the pram and more or less saying, why can't you just agree with me? Why are you doing this? And framing it as if Ross is getting some kind of pleasure and painting him as downright nihilistic at best.
Why do you not have any sense of honour about you, which allows you to offer even a semblance of balance? Again, you
Piers,
laugh.
it's very brave of you to talk about honour when the one thing the British public know about you is that you were sacked from a newspaper for lying about British troops on the front page and refusing to apologise for it.
Right,
so it's
the reason I didn't
talk about honour.
I knew you would do this, so let me explain what happened there. I was sacked from the Daily Mirror for publishing photographs of some British troops, rogue elements of a regiment, who had been abusing Iraqis.
And it had the desired effect. The terms of the debate are now personal, and Piers will actually score a one-up on Ross here. It shouldn't be coming to this, genuinely. This is what a debate fraught with intellectual dishonesty looks like. It's now just a nasty argument. But again, I'd argue that Piers has hardcore gaslit Ross and is now playing the victim. This will damage Ross in the long term if the neutrals listen to Piers' wounded cries of defence.
I then sat down with General Nick Carter, the head of the British Army, several years ago in northern France, and he told me that I was right to publish what I published. So I'm sure you know more than the head of the British Army 2 years ago, but I suspect you don't. Rather like you don't know more than what happened in Bengal.
Here is where we'll talk about the hill of reach, as Shane Snow so eloquently puts it. This is the process of taking a question and completely sidestepping it to talk about what you actually want to talk about, usually something completely unrelated. Now, the hill of reach is typically used to break off to a tangent and talk about that, but here, Piers actually uses it to get back on track from the tangent. However impressive, this is still logically fallacious, as just because, and I'm giving Piers the benefit of the doubt here, Ross is wrong about his attack on him, it bears no resemblance to how right or wrong he is about Winston Churchill. So, nice try, Piers, but no dice. Please don't fall for this fallacy. Someone can be wrong about some things and right about others.
Rather like you don't know more than what happened in Bengal during the famine and Winston Churchill's culpability. But let me come to a wider...
And here we have another dirty debate tactic. A false ending. Piers puts that argument to one side and immediately starts another conversation entirely. This has denied Ross the opportunity to respond to his comments, and since Piers is the one who closed it, gives the impression that he has won. This is a tactic named by Ian Danskin as controlling the conversation, used to essentially drown out opposition and give the illusion of winning.
Let me ask you this. Do you believe that Winston Churchill did anything positive in World War II for the people of his country?
Yes, he showed strong leadership, but let's not pretend that that wipes away everything else he did.
Ross clearly and concisely sums up his point fantastically here. There's no doubt about what he's saying, he's backed it up with sources prior to this. It's a solid argument, and one that should be taken seriously. Note how he concedes that Churchill showcased strong leadership. Sounds like a positive comment, does it not? Yeah, if you're agreeing with Ross, prepare to get exceptionally annoyed at how he's about to be treated. Also, remember the seed of the logical fallacy carrot? It's starting to grow. Remember the word balance. For the sake of balance. Hey, wait a minute.
Bob mentioned what he did for miners. Miners in South Wales hate Winston Churchill because he deployed troops and police officers against them when they were just campaigning for their own rights.
Okay,
there are communities across the UK, never mind Ireland,
Damn, that was one hell of an interruption.
I asked him to say anything positive and he immediately segued.
This is a bold-faced lie by Piers. He claimed Ross has said nothing good of Churchill, yet. Do we remember this?
Yes, he showed strong leadership.
Liar, Piers!
If Churchill was a white supremacist, and Hitler clearly was a white supremacist, I mean, is there some moral equivalence between Hitler and Churchill that's being made here?
The logical fallacy carrot doesn't have the face of Hitler, but this is another seed growing into a line of debate that will be brought up later, the comparison with Hitler. Honestly, this is just another leap of logic, as Ross has not made this comparison. They have.
And if it wasn't for Sir Winston Churchill, who knows what would have happened to Great Britain?
Yeah, not just Churchill, though. If it wasn't for Churchill, President Roosevelt of America, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. But we don't pretend that Joseph Stalin was a decent man. He was a scumbag.
Oof. Debating knockout punch right there. To highlight what happened, we must first recap on the debate as a whole. The only position of positivity Piers, Susanna and Bob have put forward about Churchill is that he won the war. Ross here has simultaneously compounded his own point whilst poking a crushing hole in the opposition argument. It's the chess equivalent of improving your defensive position with a mate-in-one threat, and is very easy to explain. If the only defence of Winston Churchill they can mount is about the war effort, then fair enough, that is a pretty big plus. He led the country to not lose the war. But Joseph Stalin also did that, so why do we have a negative view of Stalin and not Churchill? Is it the other stuff? I'm not drawing an equivalence between the two, but one thing is very clear. They both won the war. If that's enough to absolve Churchill of any criticism regarding white supremacist views, why is it not enough to absolve Stalin of his crimes? Sorry for getting excited. I'm just honestly really impressed by this move.
This is about us taking a rounded view of history. You said yourselves these are complex
characters. You have no rounded view of history. You're
here
just
in the UK, we are unable.
There it is, the logical fallacy carrot. If you need me to explain the problem with Piers' balance comment, I'll be happy to oblige, though I'd invite you to pause the video and have a go at it first, like a little challenge. The problem is this. Piers is shouting about balance like Ross didn't offer any concession, which, as we've discussed, is a lie. The thing is, though, Piers himself is also being incredibly unbalanced because he has offered no concession to Ross, save for a massive downplaying of Churchill's flaws and a kind of sweeping statement earlier, and that doesn't really count. Balance is a very abused term throughout political discourse. It's usually thrown out to discredit an argument or individual by turning it into a partisan issue. I mean, check out the climate debate right now. 97% of research points towards humans contributing to climate change, whereas 3% will receive 50% plus talking time in a public discussion for the sake of balance. John Bercow was frequently accused of being unbalanced during the parliamentary scrutiny of the Brexit deal, yet all he had really done was to allow perhaps the greatest balance ever by allowing the entire parliament to scrutinise the government. And here, Piers is literally attempting to use it to discredit Ross's point, while simultaneously being the opposite side of the exact same reason coin. This is why debates shouldn't be moderated by the debaters.
I know he was a flawed character. I also know that he almost single-handedly dragged this country from the abyss in World War II.
That's wildly ahistorical.
No, wildly historical. When you say something's wildly historical, Mr. Greer, what you mean is correct, because history is history. No. So when you say I'm wildly historical, you mean I'm right.
You're wildly ahistorical.
You said
false.
Historical.
No, that's...
No.
Yep. Piers is continuing to downplay here. Also, this is another hilarious moment where Piers mishears Ross and decides to just fucking run with it. Susanna Reid literally cringes. Look at this face. This is the face of...
Oh, fucking twat.
I think the thing is, Ross, you seem to be articulating a completely isolated, unique version of history.
More on balance. Susanna Reid trying her luck after her pal fucked up. Unfortunately, it's just the same old hypocritical accusation being thrown out.
Well, you are, aren't you? I mean, everybody celebrates Sir Winston Churchill.
No, they don't. If you go to
hero.
India, Ireland, Kenya, they absolutely don't. If you come to communities like Clydebank that I represent, if you go to the South Wales valleys, these mining communities, the problem is these points of view that have been long held, since Churchill did things to these communities, have not been allowed to get out because the prevailing narrative is of a war hero who you cannot speak ill of. But he is a complex character and we need to start being honest about our own history.
Every time the panel call him unbalanced, they are committing the dirty debating act of accusing the opposition of doing something they themselves are doing. And with lies to boot? Jeez.
We need to start being honest about our own history.
You can be critical, but the way that you're speaking about him...
More interruption, but we're used to it at this point. However, this here is Susanna Reid shifting the goalposts. She's playing the "it's not what you said, it's how you said it" card, which, of course, only seeks to prove that they're running out of things to counter Ross with.
And it's the equivalence with Hitler.
Yeah. Well, that's a lie. At no point has Ross made the equivalence with Hitler. Only they have made that leap of logic.
No one is denying that every historical hero should be scrutinised.
More lies and more gnawing of that logical fallacy carrot. No one is denying every historical hero should be scrutinised? Except, yes, you are, or at least you haven't offered any concession or addressed any of Ross's points head on. They love that false equivalency line about all heroes having some flaws too, don't they? Sorry, I'm trying not to sound like I'm ridiculing them, but they're beyond laughable at this point.
I was just going to completely agree with what you were saying. Nobody is saying that you can't reevaluate people, and every generation and every great historian looks at history afresh, which is really important for us, an understanding of life. But there is a difference between a great historian summing up and reevaluating a great man's life and your rather trite, infantile sloganeering, saying, oh, I'm going to stick a racist tag on this person or a sexist tag on that person. This is not history. This is just silly slogan
And you know
politics.
what it's become?
So Bob's line about infantile sloganeering is honestly a pretty common tactic. It's the tactic of dismissal. Bob categorises Ross's points as slogan politics and therefore wishes to give the impression of this is why your ideas are invalid or not worth addressing. This tactic is also referred to as putting people in boxes. Ross has been placed in the slogan politics box, meaning that Bob wishes to insist that there is no reason to listen to Ross. This is just about as intellectually dishonest as it gets, really, because it's an effective way to channel mob mentality to completely shut down someone's argument. If enough people parrot the, yeah, slogan politics line, then the impression is made that Ross isn't worth addressing and his argument will never have the chance to resonate. And if opposing viewpoints aren't allowed the room to resonate, then only one viewpoint will prevail, an obviously terrible thing for discourse. Which is interestingly the whole reason this debate is happening right now, if you think about it. Are we talking about meta-debate?
You know what's become worse than that, is that there's a younger generation, and you'll absolutely epitomise this, who decide to twist history to suit a narrative that people like Winston Churchill are evil people.
This argument here is essentially Piers shouting, "These darn kids!" This is another box Ross has been chucked in, and if I were him, I'd have been mortifyingly upset right now. All the research and reading he's done around this, and it's all being thrown back in his face because he's in his 20s.
Who decide to twist history to suit a narrative that people like Winston Churchill are evil people.
This video is getting a bit long now, but go look up the process of whitewashing history and what it can do to societal perception. Then watch this clip again.
And you have not presented a single positive thought process about Winston Churchill at all.
Balance, again. Honestly, I think they've run out of steam and just want Ross to go away now. If only they'd just, I don't know, listen to him? It's never too late to change your mind, people.
And they'll be saying, why does this kid, who's 24, who's somehow been an elected official in Scotland...
So this just isn't fair. And in fact, if I were Ross, I'd have snapped at this point and left. Kudos for keeping your cool here, Ross. This man's career has been attacked for no feasible reason, which is a particularly shitty and dishonest thing to do, even by your standards, Piers.
Why does he not actually appreciate the great that Winston Churchill did, even if he doesn't like some of the other stuff that he did?
Carrot.
And when you say that you drew no equivalence between Churchill and Hitler, we all know that Hitler was a white supremacist mass murderer. So when your only categorization of Winston Churchill in a tweet with all your clapping emojis is that Churchill was a white supremacist mass murderer, you are doing an equivalence with Adolf Hitler. You are saying the man that saved us, you are saying the man who saved us from the Nazis is actually no better than a Nazi himself. Do you believe that Winston Churchill was any better than a Nazi?
Of course he was. Of course he was.
But you call him a white supremacist mass murderer. That's what Nazis are, Mr. Greer. So when you say, of course he was better than Nazis, actually you want the world to think that you believe he was no better than a Nazi. That's really what you want to believe, isn't it?
So this is the final bout of logical fallacy I'll show you. Making the Nazi comparison isn't something Ross has done, and he's finally able to address this false equivalency. Ross even admits himself that Winston Churchill wasn't as bad as the Nazis. He's got more sources, more intellectual honesty by a country mile at this point, and is honestly just bearing witness to an old tiger meeting his end. Interesting point of thought though, is Piers currently downplaying the Nazis? Because they were a lot more than just white supremacist mass murderers. They were also fascistic, authoritarian, sexist, and misogynistic. I don't know, it's probably me being quite intellectually dishonest here, but food for thought nonetheless. And finally, the classic Piers Morgan move of narrowing Ross's options of rebuttal to a binary answer. Telling someone what they think, or putting words in their mouth, or whatever you want to call it, Piers does this a lot, and it's very dishonest to do this to your opponent, instead of letting them answer on their own merit.
All right, Mr. Greer, you know what I find revolting? You.
And the final blow, the dying gasp of the dishonest tiger, Piers has one final pop at Ross, ensuring that he gets the last word in and making whatever attempt he can to push the narrative that he won the debate. Except, After all of our scrutiny we've just performed, nothing could be further from the truth. Please, everyone, take a breather. Make yourself a nice cup of tea, you deserve it. Joking aside, I really appreciate you if you made it this far, as that was a lot of information, and genuinely, this video went on a lot longer than I expected it to. So I want to say thank you, you guys are awesome. To give my final thoughts on the debate, it's actually quite an infuriating one to watch the first few times. Piers is relentless in his quest to dishonestly stamp down Ross's point of view, and while Ross is far from immune to criticism here, well, you guys saw the video, you know how false equivalencies work now. The scale by which Ross Greer was dishonest is Callisto to Piers Morgan's star in heaven. A lot smaller for all you non-poets. As for who won the debate, well, as I said, I don't appreciate winners in debate, only the truth and scrutiny. And the truth is, I think we should all appreciate the good Winston Churchill did during the Second World War, but obviously direct the lion's share of gratitude to all the soldiers that laid their lives on the line. And we should also be honest and state the glaring fact that Winston Churchill did and said some pretty shitty things that land him the label of white supremacist and possibly mass murderer. Just not on a scale nearly as bad as Hitler's, obviously. Truthfully, my viewers, that conclusion isn't important, nor is our interpretation of Piers Morgan, Ross Greer or Susanna Reid. What's important is that you've seen a multitude of intellectually dishonest debate tactics at work and have learnt about what they are, how to spot them, and hopefully how to not use them. Great power and something such. So I hope you've enjoyed yourself watching this, and I really hope that this was helpful in cleaning up the world's discourse. And if I may break my attempt at bipartisanship, don't vote for Bob Seeley, as he's probably lying to you.